Our universe seems infinitely large, and with a similarly infinite amount of possibilities. But with each choice you make, no matter how large or small, a new universe may be born from that choice. When the infinite scale of our own universe seems impossible to comprehend, how could one ever hope to fathom the infinite quantity of universes there could be? There's a universe for every possibility you could think of, and all the possibilities you couldn't even think of thinking of. So vast that there just might be a universe out there where Sans from hit game Undertale is feeling a bit more red today. There's a lot of Undertale alternate universes, that's kind of its main thing. Taking the story and setting of Undertale, which fans had consumed every inch of, and creating new content by shifting, swapping, or felling the world of Undertale. But when I was a wee lad in the ancient bygone era of Undertale domination, the only reason I ever learned about these AUs was because of their music. Undertale's soundtrack is just objectively great, and I somehow found this community of people inspired by Toby Fox's music who started their own musical journeys on the Undertale AU Music official website, aka SoundCloud. I even began making music with the tried and true method of downloading MIDIs of Undertale songs, slapping them into GarageBand, and messing around. I'd say GarageBand only because I had a Mac growing up, but obviously the intended experience is to use FL Studio as your Undertale MIDI receptacle. Undertale AUs were an incredibly fun guideline for making music, but that also means that my opinions on many alternate universes were basically entirely formed by the musical creativity they allowed. So here I am now, putting that childhood obsession to good use. Or, mediocre use, at least, by talking about the music of Undertale AUs. This was the start of it all. Not Undertale AUs as a whole, but the start music-wise at least. Underswap was formed from the humble beginnings of wanting to make Sans more hyperactive and upbeat, slowly evolving into a more complete, what if I swapped all the Undertale characters in pairs? And yeah, pretty neat. This surely won't have a permanent, drastic impact on not only the Undertale fandom, but fandomness as a whole. A big reason this AU became so popular, both in general and for music, is that it's just a simple, clean, fun idea to take these characters and swap them. At that point, every remixer on the planet had remixed every song on the Undertale soundtrack, but Underswap invited the idea of taking the melodies and motifs of one character's themes and slapping them into the style of their swapped partner. You take Papyrus's and shove it into the style and structure of... It's a winning recipe. And this formed the basic core of most Undertale AU music. You take a great song and combine it with another great song, meaning it's a fun way to mess around with music, while also being pretty guaranteed to be at least somewhat good. And while I'd love to list some banger classic Underswap songs, the truth is that simply putting one character's melody into another character's song was an incredibly fun and easy starting point for many people musically, but it really stayed as that starting point. So while there's certainly songs I'm nostalgic for, there aren't really any of this style that I adore, because basically everyone could do it and it'd sound the same. I mean, check this out. Yeah, that's right. I made the same thing everyone else did in the early days of Underswap. And that's why, as people got better at music, they would shift away from that simple formula. You start to inject flair and complexity into the songs that didn't exist in either of the original Undertale tracks you're modifying. But the core issue stemmed from the fact that, story-wise, Underswap changed far less than you'd think. If you're swapping both the roles and personalities of a character, you're left with the same character you started with, just with a different design. And even if you retain some elements of the character you were swapping, that just means you're left with both characters being a little less distinct from one another. Admittedly, this doesn't matter when you're just here to have some fun with an Undertale obsession, but what about when you want to do something more than that? Inverted Fate is a separate AU that's basically a story fix to Underswap. It was a webcomic, so it had to deal with the fact that if you swap personalities, it makes the characters less interesting. And the solution was to just not. This created a fun story challenge where you essentially had the same characters as Undertale, but they have to take different paths in their life to end up in these swapped roles. But unfortunately, I don't have a whole lot to say on this AU because musically, it didn't really exist. I mean, yes, there was new music for it of course, but Inverted Fate had an official soundtrack associated with the comic, basically meaning that it couldn't flood SoundCloud because there was really only one source of Inverted Fate music. Plus, it was early on enough that most people didn't get that this was even different from Underswap. If there was an Inverted Fate fan song, it was usually just an Underswap song that was labeled as both. I think the only track I ever heard that was specifically for Inverted Fate was a What If Genocide track for Sans that is official, but also not canon to the comic, so yeah, I didn't really pay attention to Inverted Fate when I was younger, but as a jaded adult, I think it seems neat, just never got into it. However, that wasn't the only approach people took to avoid the staleness of Underswap. After all, a large appeal of Underswap musically was the simplicity of making music for it with the swapped personalities. So why limit yourself to just the swaps of Underswap? New AUs with new character swaps. This let people use the same formula of slap melody into a different song, but now with new combos of melodies and songs we hadn't yet experienced. The most popular swap AU I saw that wasn't Underswap had to be Story Shift. Story Shift took the pairs of characters idea and just shifted them with other pairs. Both of the Bone Brothers shifted to take the roles of Asgore and Toriel, Kara and Asriel took the roles of the Bone Brothers, and basically none of the other swaps mattered that much. People had fun doing some Papyrus-styled songs with Asriel's theme, but there was mostly a focus on doing Kara's Megalovania, or Sans's Asgore, and that kind of became a trend with these swap AUs overall. The Sans focus, or even more specifically, the Megalovania focus. There was a period of time where it felt like people would only make AUs for the sake of a Megalovania. I'm sure that wasn't actually the case. Like, I'm sure Outertale was made because somebody was legitimately interested in having Toriel take the role of Sans, but from the view of music, the only reason I even know Toriel is Sans is because of the song Dynami, Toriel's Megalovania. Well, okay, I also know that Asriel is Gaster, apparently, in the same AU because of Astral Projection. Great song, by the way. But for the most part, it felt like I'd just find a song that's like, oh, here's Undyne's Megalovania, and it's for the AU, swap shift tail, or whatever. And then a week later, I'd be hit with, here's an Alfie's Megalo for shift swap tail. Though it'd be a shame not to mention this fun Megalovania debate that I feel like may have only started because of its impact on AU music. Megalo Sans or Megalo Kara. Because swap AUs had you taking melodies from characters, it was important to know what melodies matched which characters, and the big debate was, is Megalovania Sans's battle theme or Kara's battle theme? It's Sans. At this point, everyone just defaults to it being Sans because, I mean, it's him. Nothing's ever shown Megalovania as anything but Sans's theme since Undertale released, but I'm serious, this was a big debate back then. And to be honest, making Megalovania Kara's theme isn't that bad, at least not music-wise. Bro, Sans already has a theme. The only other option Kara had for a theme back then was Megalo Strike Back, a Toby Fox song with Megalo in the title that's otherwise entirely unrelated to Undertale, but was kinda just co-opted by fans as a theme for Kara. Or Gaster sometimes. But people liked Megalovania more, and it was actually in Undertale, so that makes sense as a popular option. The argument of we've become so strong by the end of the genocide route that this is our boss theme is fair enough, but I still think this debate was largely fueled by what people thought would be fun to do for whatever AU they wanted to do music for. For example, Story Shift has Kara taking the place of Sans. That's a pretty major role, and if they had no motif to work with, then you're kinda out of luck for a big chunk of the soundtrack. So letting yourself use Megalovania for them makes sense. Although that means Story Shift doesn't actually get a Kara Megalovania because because you have to use the motifs of the character replacing Kara, which is Metaton in this case, and I just find that funny. On the flip side, I never saw people argue Megalokara for Underswap, because that'd mean Megalovania would have to be based on Frisk? And who would want to do that instead of a Papyrus Megalovania? Except for this one random guy who I can only assume did it specifically because nobody had done it. But that song sucks, and whoever made it should be ashamed. I hope they went on to do nothing ever since. Nowadays, Megalokara has pretty largely died out. In fact, an incredible story shift Megalovania I found recently just did this. Does this sound like Megalovania at all? No. Is it basically just an entirely original song, loosely based on Black from Homestuck because Kara has no motifs to work from otherwise? Yeah, and I adore it. You should check it out. Other creative solutions I've found tend to use the creepy drone sound that plays at the end of the genocide route, or a modification of the end of Once Upon a Time that isn't part of Azrael's theme, since those are the only two audio tracks that actually have direct ties to Kara's only appearances, but I actually thought Megalokara had stopped entirely until I stumbled across this song. Swapfell - versus Susie. This is another amazing track that I love a lot, but just the many layers of its premise were what really intrigued me. I mean, for one, versus Susie? Susie isn't an Undertale. But the convenient thumbnail battle mockup shows us that this is a genocide route fight versus Papyrus with our name as Susie, which implies that Susie is taking the place of Kara? So this is a Megalokara track, where Susie is swapped with Kara since Kara is Chris Deltarune and Chris with Susie is a logical pair to swap. If you didn't understand any of that, then you won't be ready for the test. And hey, versus Susie is my favorite Deltarune track, so I'll take it. Plus, swapping Kara with Susie instead of with Frisk makes things a lot more interesting, since that's actually a character instead of a player stand-in. And in case you're wondering, Swapfell is actually a combination AU. Look, we were really running out of AUs fast, but this combines Underswap with another one of the biggest AUs in Undertale, which, much like Swap, created a whole category of its own. What if Sans and Papyrus were evil? Actually, no, this AU, unlike nearly all others, wasn't created with the Boner Bros first. Instead, it actually started with the idea of a murderous Toriel. Underfell is an AU where everyone is evil now, except for the ones who were originally evil. They're nice now. But apparently, Underfell was nearly the first AU for Undertale ever, and not the actual first, but it is the first largely popular one, and everyone knows that's what really matters. Which was a surprise to me because Underswap music seemed way more popular and widespread before I saw Underfell hit the scene. But in retrospect, it makes sense that Underfell wasn't as dominant in the music scene because Underfell is what I'm gonna arbitrarily call a tonal AU instead of a swap AU. That means rather than switching around the characters, we're just switching the overall vibe of Undertale. And here's the thing, back in my toxic SoundCloud era, I hated these types of AUs. But, in my defense, that's because early Underfell music sucked mega balls. Most early Underfell tracks were just poorly made rock covers of Undertale songs using the default FL Studio guitar plugin. Nowadays, I'm a little nostalgic for that crappy sound, but it was crappy, believe me. This meant I had no interest in any tonal AUs like this because they were all so lazy with their music. I mean, the swap formula was lazy too, don't get me wrong, but it was at least a more fun result to listen to than just default Undertale songs where all the instruments are guitars. And that sucks, because Underfell is actually really great. To be honest, I don't really know if this was always the case, but modern Underfell seems to sit in that territory of, yeah, we're edgy and evil and we take ourselves way too seriously, but it's all just fun absurdity because of that, which I just adore. Maybe that's because there's more serious takes on fully evil Undertale, and again, decent chance that Underfell was always more for fun, and younger me was just like, edgy characters, that's cringe, he said whilst being cringe. But that shift in opinion now is also largely because of the dramatic shift in Underfell music as of late. For example, MEGALOVANIA, the core of all AUs. While I've been avoiding listing specific examples of songs I dislike, both because I don't tend to remember things I didn't like 8 years ago, and also because that's just mean, I will do it here because it's so important to Underfell music as a whole, and it's so long ago that, like, come on. Obviously, the person who made this is better at music at this point. If your old stuff isn't worse, then you haven't improved. With that being said, Underfell had one Megalovania at the start that was so popular that people kind of avoided making any other Megalos for Underfell for years. And I thought this one sounded so bad. Now, admittedly, going back to it more recently, I still think it sounds bad. It's kinda just normal Megalovania with a bunch of discordant notes slapped on a ton of realistic guitars. However, it's mainly just the start that I don't like at all. From 30 seconds onwards, it's a mix of alright to rough, but this was unfortunately the basis of Underfell music for a long time. But as time oft does to those of ill, it got better. And it wasn't even a gradual change. It felt like people slowly got sick of Underfell and just moved on to making music for other AUs. Then everyone came back years later with enhanced music skills and respect for the good old Underfeller, and turned it into this incredibly cool AU musically. For example, covers of that old Megalovania track that actually make it sound really good. Though, honestly, I don't know how much credit you could give to the original, since these covers tend to do a lot of cool new sections and flair that the original just simply didn't possess. But also, thank God, different takes on an Underfell Megalovania. Some personal favorites of mine are Dachnovania, which goes for a fun swing that I just really love, and sets it apart from the default Undertale's Megalovania, which is already pretty intense like Underfell tends to go, so it's fun to take a different direction. This song also manages to still keep heavy use of guitars while actually sounding good and intentional. Another one is Eye for an Eye, which is part of an Underfell-centered section for the fangame Delta Traveler, and this song takes the approach of being more specifically an evil Sans battle theme, rather than being a version of Megalovania, which is a really fun approach. Plus, it nails this specific vibe of insanity with the main lead, rather than being purely evil. And the last one I'll mention is Misjudgment, which goes for a kind of anime opening style of intensity. I don't know how else to describe it, but that also sets it apart as very unique from the usual heavy rock style of Megalovania. Wait, 7 years ago? I thought this one was newer. Whoops. No, wait, 7 years ago is 2018? Ugh, I'm ancient. But it wasn't just Megalovania. There were finally other songs to be excited about with Underfell. In fact, quite recently, it's been common for people to do takes of Underfell, making entire soundtracks for it, which I've been loving. There's the aptly named Underfell project by Another Medium, which is a complete Underfell soundtrack with a lot of great songs. I'll be honest though, quite a few of them are just original songs that vaguely fit the structure of the Undertale counterparts rather than sounding like evil versions of the original songs, but I'll gladly take great sounding original song over Undertale track in minor key. And Another Medium makes a ton of amazing songs outside of their Underfell project that are vaguely connected to Undertale/Deltarune. Like one of their newest tracks, Serpentine, based on the beta design of Queen Deltarune. I know that's not relevant at all here since that's not Undertale, nor an AU, but it's a really neat song, alright? Though, if you really want an Underfell soundtrack that takes those original Undertale songs and makes them appropriately evil, you gotta check out Underfell Your Choice. An ongoing soundtrack where the story decisions are based on community votes, just like Homestuck. Homestuck fans when they see choices. I think You Can't Leave is by far my favorite evil version of Heartache I've ever heard. This part especially, very saucy. And the drop of Whispers of Waterfall is deliciously foreboding. Though honestly, it makes sense in retrospect that a community of people just getting into music because of Undertale would only really be able to slap some electric guitars on a track to make it sound evil. But the Underfell tracks of today take way more creative approaches to evil music. and combined with the general vibe of unseriously serious edginess that I love, it's made Underfell definitely a top AU for me. Big turnaround from the days of old, and all thanks to people just having fun making their own versions of the concept. The only other AU with so many alternative takes is Underswap. In fact, there was an Underswap take that was so popular, I think it's the whole reason this trend even started. And real quick, spoiler warning for each fan game I talk about here. I try to avoid spoilers, but the coolest songs tend to be the big epic boss fights, so spoil at your own risk. TS Underswap is Underswap as an actual game. However, it doesn't follow the original Underswap when it comes to personalities, or designs, or really anything outside of the fact that the same characters switch places. It's basically a completely new approach to Underswap made by Team Switched. And that's also what I believe really kicked off the trend of people doing their own versions of old AUs. The game started development a long time ago, only a year or two after Undertale itself came out, but their original approach to making this game was flawed. They had a Game Jolt page that basically served as a collection of random Underswap SoundCloud tracks, designs loosely modified from the original Underswap, and clearly no actual idea on how to make this a game, or what this game even was. Now, that's a little harsh, but that's just how Undertale fan games went back then. That's how all Undertale fan stuff went back then. Undertale inspired many people to try creating things for the first time, and so many people were having to learn in real time. But making a game is harder than even most major game developers want to deal with, so they'd struggled a lot more. One of the big things that really showed me that this Underswap fan game was not doing well was, surprise surprise, the soundtrack, comprised of fan music that wasn't really made like a video game song is supposed to be. To show what I mean by what a video game song is supposed to be, let's look at MEGALOVANIA. Very random example, I know. MEGALOVANIA needs to be able to loop infinitely because you don't know how long a player is going to be in the fight. It also needs to have a fairly consistent level of energy or tension because you have no way of knowing what exactly will be happening at any point in the song outside of just you're in a fight. So if you do use something calmer, it better be building up tension to an explosive continuation of the high energy the song needs. You also can't use sound effects from the game in the song itself. I know it's cool in a standalone song, but for a video game soundtrack, you risk making players confused when suddenly the sound of Sans charging up a Gaster Blaster plays when he isn't actually charging up a Gaster Blaster. I feel like most people back at the start of AU music didn't even realize that they were straying so far from standard video game practice. Actually, it'd probably be fun to take the original MEGALOVANIA and restyle it the way that AU MEGALOVANIAs often were to really highlight the differences between an AU song and the real thing. No, I'm sure only an idiot would think that's a good idea. To be clear though, doing all these things is fine for songs that just need to stand on their own. It's only if you're trying to make a soundtrack for a game that you're gonna realize why these types of rules exist. And that was seemingly a large part of why TS Underswap struggled so much early on. But unlike nearly every other fan game of the time, TS Underswap persisted, getting rid of everything that didn't work and restarted with the concept of being a game at its core. Eventually, they released an actual game, or demo at least, and you could really see how they recognized and fixed the issues of their soundtrack by giving it all a great, consistent style despite having so many composers, and making all the songs fit for the context of a game. It also helped that Team Switched took a similar approach that Inverted Fate did by largely retaining the personalities of the characters when they swap, but with the added benefit of getting to change the entire underground as well, like turning the ruins into this huge city for Asgore to preside over. With a stronger identity for the whole game concept and stronger personalities for each swap, the music ends up pretty great. In fact, in quite the flip from usual Underswap fare, a lot of melodies ended up very different from the original Undertale motifs, and yet the music manages to still feel like the Undertale characters we're familiar with through just the vibe of the song itself, while also feeling fitting for their new role. It's neat. A personal favorite of mine has gotta be Stage Fright. It just sounds really good. I also really like the name, but it's pretty cool because of the specific composer of this track, Lucas Pukis, that's gotta be how it's pronounced surely, was one of my favorite AU composers back in the early days. A lot of his early stuff is a little rough on revisit, but that's just how improvement goes. His more recent stuff is incredible. It's just so cool seeing these names I recognize from the era of let's just have fun messing with Undertale's soundtrack to learn how to make music come back around to be making incredible stuff that almost feels entirely independent from Undertale. I mean, TS Underswap made such good original content that they took the Snowden section, which was based entirely around the most beloved characters in Undertale, and went, yeah, but what about we make this section entirely about these brand new characters with new music and personalities and everything, and it just worked. In fact, these goons, Harry and Larry, contributed to my favorite moment in the game, alongside my favorite creepy, off-putting track for basically any interpretation of a genocide route I think I've ever heard. But yeah, it makes sense that the big old Underswap would get a huge fan game for it, which is why it also makes sense that there's a fan game for the equally big AU. Okay, yeah, that was sarcasm. Maybe I'm dumb, but Project Spacetime's Outertale fan game felt like it came out of nowhere. I didn't think Outertale was that popular when I was younger, but I've kind of realized that Outertale was actually the origin of the secret third pillar of AU styles, new setting AUs. There are a lot of Undertale AUs that change the setting from the underground to somewhere else, but Outertale was one of the most popular by taking those underground monsters out of their cave and into space. But the reason I didn't think of these as a major pillar of AUs is that, much like early Underfell, Outertale did not have great music at the start because it simply wasn't made for it. Swap AUs are good for music since they give you a simple way to create a fun new combination of Toby Fox songs. Tonal AUs were bad for music because people wouldn't modify the original songs enough to be interesting at first, they'd just kinda change the genre. But eventually it landed in a pretty fun place once people were good enough at music to change the songs a lot while still nailing the vibe of the AU. But new setting AUs really aren't for music since they have the same issue as early Underfell with no real alternative. Where Underfell was just Undertale songs with too many electric guitars, Outertale was just Undertale songs with too many synths. But that makes sense. The whole point of having Undertale in a new setting is almost entirely visual, which is why the fan game focuses so much on cool space scenes. They certainly addressed these soundtrack issues as best they could. PS Outertale's music is a lot more varied than the old synth covers I remember from the past, but the soundtrack's still largely just spacey remixes of Undertale songs. And I think that's fair. I don't know what else they'd do. But that's why these kinds of setting-changing AUs aren't really that interesting music-wise. I remember another big new setting AU, Outertale. I'll let you guess what setting that takes place in. And I thought the character designs were really cool, but the music? You do some accordions? Have that kinda piratey swing to it? I don't know, there's not much to go on. I think PS Outertale is a cool fan game, and I like a lot of its new elements in basically every category except for music. Although, as seems to pretty commonly be the case, my favorite part of Outertale's soundtrack was one of the few original songs they had, GALACTOMANIA. But if the most original tracks in these AUs keep ending up as my favorite parts, then clearly we should just make an AU of entirely original songs. It's all your favorite Undertale, but now in a fashionable yellow. Except all my favorite Undertale look a little different. And by that I mean, this is just an entirely original game with some references to Undertale. Undertale Yellow is an incredible fan game with an incredible soundtrack. Every song is, at the very least, comparable in quality to the original Undertale soundtrack, which is insane. Honestly, there are so many tracks here that I love more than so many tracks in Undertale, and that's a seriously impressive feat. Though I feel like I should point out that I lied. When talking about TS Underswap, I was like, oh, most Undertale fan games tend to get abandoned. Underswap was a unique case where they persisted, yada yada. But Yellow started development a year or two after Undertale's release, just like TS Underswap did, but it never ran into major trouble. The team just chugged along in the background for years to finish the whole game from start to finish. And you can kinda tell that because the game gets better as it goes on, which is lucky for us because usually the best songs of a game are near the end. Though, yeah, kinda just a fully original game. This is barely linked to Undertale outside of starting with Toriel, having the end goal of Asgore, and Flowey's dumb mug showing up at every save point. I didn't have much to say on Outertale because it was too similar to Undertale, but Yellow has the opposite issue because its music stands on its own so strongly that I can't compare it much. A lot of the Undertale AU music scene in general has shifted to basically being original tracks. There's some songs out there that'll be like, yeah, this is a song for an Underswap version where Papyrus went crazy, killed everyone to grow strong enough to stop the player's genocide route, but Sans tried to stop Papyrus by killing him and then later realized himself that the player is evil, so now Sans is gonna kill the player while powered by Papyrus's ghost. And then it's just a sick 8-minute long entirely original rock song with basically no connections to Undertale. But if I'm being honest, the songs in Yellow that take motifs from Undertale ended up being the weakest. That doesn't mean they were bad, but that just goes to show how amazing the original songs were that the few based on Toby Fox's music are usually the least notable to me. Though I will say, all of the tracks related to Flowey at the end of the game are amazing. And, you know, I'm just gonna gush about this for a bit, which is gonna go into mega spoiler territory, so I guess just skip to the next section if you don't want to hear about it. But man, every track related to the Flowey fight at the end of the neutral route is such incredible insanity. I guess I'm just realizing I'm a sucker for a good creepy or evil song. Like, Best Friends Forever is such a cool remix of Flowey's little dinky theme, and along with the visuals of that first phase create such an incredible contrast to the rest of the game, just like the Omega Flowey fight did in normal Undertale. But this is done in an entirely new, special way. And then Afterlife and that whole second phase manages to accomplish the same cool contrast as Omega Flowey did in the same way that Omega Flowey did, which I really didn't think it would be possible to replicate that feeling. I know that earlier I was like, video game songs shouldn't use sound effects from the game, and Afterlife does that a lot, using basically every Flowey related sound effect it can in the track. But let me just justify my hypocrisy real quick. 1, those sound effects aren't used in the battle itself, so it doesn't become too confusing for players. And 2, I don't care, it's so cool and fitting for this fight. It really makes you feel like Flowey. I think both these tracks do an amazing job at distorting the familiar sounds related to Flowey into incredibly intimidating boss themes. And then there's the specimen sections during the fight, and God, I'm a sucker for a cool reference, and these are nothing but cool references to things, both musically and visually. Each specimen track also just sounds so good on their own. I don't know if I could just sit and jam to one of the soul sections from Your Best Nightmare, but the specimen sections of Afterlife? Yeah, I think I've listened to each one individually on loop for hours before. They're all just so cool. Gosh, this is why I don't like just talking about something I love when I can't pinpoint specific things to say about it. I'm just saying it's so cool over and over, but like, it is. Whatever, that's enough about Flowey. There are tons of other songs I love in Yellow that are fully original, like Enemy Retreating, Through the Macro Lens, End of the Line. But to avoid just saying they sound good for every song, I'll refrain for now. As time's gone on, so many AU tracks have shifted towards being original, and that's cool, but what I really want to do here is explore Undertale AU music specifically, so what about... So, there used to be a secret fourth pillar of Undertale AUs that I guarantee is the last to my knowledge. Crossover AUs, where you take characters not from Undertale and slap them into Undertale. This was the pure, unfiltered AU goodness I've somewhat missed in recent times. Though I really only mention it in past tense because I feel like it's gone out of style. AUs like Undertoad, where you fill the underground with Mario characters, or Spongetail, where you fill the underground with SpongeBob characters, or those are really the only ones I remember. And the thing with crossover AUs is that they're basically purely musical. Maybe there was some fun stories or designs, but the main appeal here is just remixing some music from other things you like into the Undertale style. And usually these AUs didn't stand out from tons of people making their own music for it, they would just stand out because one person made one or two cool tracks for it. Like, I can't tell you what was really going on in Spongetail, but Ocean Trousel was a cool remix of Ocean Man in the style of Bone Trousel. And Bibulus was a cool SpongeBob Megalovania that included a lot of fun songs from the show's history. And I mainly remember Undertoad because this cover of Luigi's Bone Trousel, Arc of El Lightning, is just an incredible song. But there's also this other cover, this time of Game Over, a Megalovania for Bowser, which combines so many Mario songs and samples. Though, actually, both Game Over and Bibulus aren't even from the base AUs, like, Bibulus is from Underswap, because SpongeBob is Papyrus, so you have to do an Underswap in there to make him Sans so that you can do Megalovania, and Game Over is Toad Spin, which is Undertoad plus Story Spin. Don't ask, I don't know, I do know, but that's besides the point. That just goes to show you what it was like in that sort of middle stage of Undertale AU music. People were making any random AU they wanted, combining them together, just doing whatever to justify any song they wanted to make. Eventually that broke off into realizing, I don't need to make an AU to justify making a Bone Trousel for Professor Layton, I could just do that. Kind of like how I don't need to come up with a clever transition to justify talking about other cool AU music. Undertale Halloween Hack is an AU that doesn't really fit into any mold. Conceptually, it's just Toby Fox made the Earthbound Halloween Hack. Let's do that again with Undertale, which means I'm not sure, actually. It started as a webcomic, but the comic never got far, so now it's kinda just a collection of really cool music that's vaguely Undertale themed. But man, some of these songs are incredible. Truer Than Fiction is just a fan-made Gaster battle theme from years ago that's amazing in its own right, but the cover made for Halloween Hack I love a ton. There's also the track Monsoon, an altered take on Dummy that combines it with the vibe of Deltarune's secret boss themes, but it's actually this cover of it by Antagonist that made me absolutely fall in love with the song. Genuinely astounding cover. Though if you know anything about the Undertale Halloween Hack, you'll know No More Nuzzles. An AU song so incredible that half the fanbase thinks it was made by Toby Fox. Though you can't really blame them when it became the poster child of a meme basically saying, man, this Toby Fox song is crazy. But what if I told you that there was a secret enhanced version made by the original composer years later? Well, you should probably believe me because constantly remaking and updating music is pretty standard in the Undertale SoundCloud scene. Like I said, everyone's always improving, so it makes sense to revisit your old stuff and redo it. I mean, even Toby Fox himself did that. Though I suppose I should call out Luna specifically here as the original composer of No More Nuzzles, not only because they made that one song, but also because they have their grubby little fingers in so many insanely good AU songs like Dissension, by far the most popular Swapfell Megalovania ever, besides the Versus Susie one I showed earlier, which is also made by them. But if we're already calling out specific creators, I also want to bring up Sunhat Girl, who, yeah, has made some really cool Undertale songs like That Feeling in Your Bones, an absolutely astounding non-megalo battle theme for Sans, or A Sky with No Stars, an Outertale Megalovania that manages to be a super atmospheric battle theme without overusing spacey synths, or World of Infinite Choices, an incredible Doki Doki Literature Club themed version of Big Shot. I guess that's Deltarune, not Undertale. But to be honest, my favorite songs from Sun Hat Girl are the fully original songs like All That Pizzazz, Relapse, and City, but hey, give me a break here, I'm trying my best to stay Undertale focused. Oh, what about this? She did a really cool set of Friday Night Funkin' styled songs for Sans. I like those a lot too. On Break is my favorite. Okay, look, I know I was constantly saying, I'm talking too much about songs that are practically just original. I need to focus on songs that are clearly based on Undertale, and I've failed that repeatedly. But can you blame me? Undertale AU music has always been so cool to me, not because of how it reflects on Undertale, or even just so I can hear clever reinterpretations of Toby Fox music. That's all fun, yeah, but the real appeal has always been the value it has as just a source of cool songs. A group of people who all love Undertale's music, all learning how to make music of their own by slowly modifying the tracks they were inspired by more and more until everyone's just solid composers in their own right. Honestly, one of my favorite parts is that it's so easy to learn from and iterate on everything people make directly, leading to that fun community-wide growth. Everybody's working on FL Studio because that's what Undertale was composed on, everyone's using the same sound fonts that Undertale uses, and so many people are willing to just share the project files of what they make for others to look at. On top of that, basically every song in the Undertale soundtrack has been dissected and recreated by fans for you to learn from yourself. Undertale AU music has been a constant source of inspiration for me, and I can't imagine I'd have even started making music if this community wasn't a thing. So no, the music of Undertale AUs aren't really modifications of Undertale tracks anymore. But if you want to hear a bunch of incredible music from people inspired by Toby Fox's work, there's really no better place.